Greetings to you out there in podcast world. This is Tony Denton coming to you from the Phoenix, Arizona area this 4th day of February 2020. It's hard to believe it's 2020. It's a lot different writing that than all those teen numbers we've been writing for a decade now. Anyway, I did the preface this morning and posted it for you. I'm not sure which day I'll post this, but today is the 4th of February. And we are ready to head right on into the introductory pages of my audiobook installment today on my book called James, From Persecuted to Perfected Fulfilled. We are on page 1. Nearly 20 years have passed since I first decided I really wanted to delve into the Epistle of James and create a 10-lesson series to share with Christians around the country as I was called to hold week-long meetings. At the time, I felt like there was no other book in the Bible as pragmatic as this one to use in encouraging God's people in their daily Christian living. In preparation for those studies through James, I ended up not being able to get the number of lessons under 11, though at least 12 would have been better. So I opted to omit much of the introductory material, namely who wrote it, to whom it was written, and when it was written, while emphasizing the solutions, the what part, James shared with his audience in relation to their needs, the why part. However, now as I peruse all my old material with the thought of polishing it up, going through it again with people in my area, and eventually putting it into book form for others, I realize that it's actually essential in our day and time for me to not neglect answering questions that are normally considered an introduction to a biblical book like James. What has changed for me? Just this. In my latter years, I've come to realize the truly immense importance of the principle called audience relevance. In other words, if we don't have a grasp on who the audience was and what was written in this personal letter pertaining directly to them, not only might we misinterpret something in it, but we might also and or therefore misapply something from its contents to us today that actually doesn't apply, or doesn't apply in the same manner to us as it did to them. So, although my ultimate goal in this series of now 14 studies is the same as 20 years ago, that is, to encourage Christians in their daily living, I'm compelled by hermeneutical principles to cajole you, my 21st century audience, to screen that encouragement through first century colored glasses. So, who was the James who authored this epistle? What I'd like to say in answer to this question is what we as kids used to say to any given querist. You tell me and we'll both know. What's meant by this is that I believe it's impossible to know with certainty which James wrote this letter, for all we have in it related to the identity of the author is that his name was James, and he was a servant of God and Christ, chapter 1, verse 1. There's a ton of information among scholars attempting to answer this question, but the simple fact is that we just cannot know for sure who authored it, especially since, depending on many variables, within the New Testament there are as many as 6, and I've read even as many as 8, men named James. From my research into this issue, I'm on the rather strong view that one of the elders of the Jerusalem church, Acts 12:17, Acts 15:13, Acts 21:18, was the author of this epistle. And I further believe he was the biological brother of Jesus. Okay, next question. Who was this James addressing in this epistle? James opened this letter addressing it to the 12 tribes. What we can know for certain from this is that James, himself a Hebrew, was addressing other Hebrews, that is, people of the 12 tribes who comprise Old Covenant national Israel. However, from the opening verse, as well as other information throughout the letter, such as chapter 2, verse 1, we can also know that James, a disciple of Jesus, hence a Christian, was addressing other Christians. So without getting carried away with all the variant technicalities one can find in commentaries and other writings about the precise identity of the recipients of this letter, it doesn't really seem all that difficult to conclude from the simplicity of what I just stated that a Hebrew Christian was addressing other Hebrew Christians. And whether there were those among these recipients who had no Hebrew blood in their veins doesn't negate this. They were merely blessed along with those of the Israelites who had accepted Jesus as the promised Messiah and were thus being persecuted for that decision by their brethren who rejected Jesus as that anointed one. Furthermore, besides being penned by and sent from James of Jerusalem, we can also learn from the opening statement that those to whom it was addressed lived in several locales throughout the Roman Empire. Hundreds of years prior, God had prophesied that the 10 tribes who split off from the 2 tribes would be swallowed up among the Gentiles, quote unquote, Hosea 8 verses 7 and 8. And indeed, that's what they were by the time of this final generation of Israel's existence. And because they had been so assimilated for over 700 years, by this time they, who Jesus meant by his other sheep in John 10:16, were called Gentiles by the Jews, the 2 tribes who remain in Jerusalem. See, just as Jesus sought out all those of the 2 Jewish tribes who would accept him as a promised Messiah, so he sought out all those of the 10 Israelite tribes who would accept him as the promised Messiah. And all those of both sets of tribes, when found and brought together into one fold, John 10, would be the last of the faithful remnant of national Israel. It was to many of these scattered people to whom James was writing in order to, as we'll discuss momentarily, encourage them in their lives which were running counter to the rest of those who comprised the 12 tribes. In other words, those who were persecuting the faithful sect and remnant called Christians. Moving on, when did this James author this epistle? The question of when this letter was penned is about as difficult to answer as the question of exactly which James penned it. There isn't much at all in the letter itself that aids in an answer to that question. All I can do here is curtly say that I agree with John A.T. Robinson's conclusion in his book, Redating the New Testament, that it was penned in AD 47 or 48, meaning it's a very early writing. Since the Jerusalem church elder James died as early as 62, then, if he were indeed the author, this letter must of course have been authored before that time. There's something extremely important that we must consider before delving into this epistle. For if we fall short in grasping this, then we'll surely fall short in accurately applying what we read in this great letter. I'd like to have dealt with this topic as it came up in our studies later, but as I was working through them, I realized that such clearly would not work. Meaning that a huge amount of what I want to share with you about this letter from the point of view of its historical setting would not make sense to most people, even and perhaps especially Christians, in our 21st century. So to what topic might I be referring? Well, since it's found most noticeably in James chapter 5, let's briefly consider 2 statements from that chapter in relation to our question concerning when James was penned. Firstly, in chapter 5, verse 7, James told these, our first generation persecuted suffering Christian brethren, to be patient until the coming, that is, the parousia of the Lord. The word parousia means presence, referring to the arrival or the result of a coming. So although presence is its actual meaning, it isn't referring to a presence that was already in existence, but a presence that would be the result of a coming. That would be the Greek word erchomai. Erchomai refers to the action of the coming, while parousia refers to the result of the coming, parousia, the presence of Christ. But what's more important for us right now is this. Notice that James didn't encourage those brethren to be patient till they died, but to be patient till their Lord returned. And you know what? This isn't the only place in the New Testament in which an inspired man wrote and spoke like this. Matthew 26:64, John 21:20 through 22, 1 Corinthians 1:7 through 8, 1 Thessalonians 5:23, 1 Timothy 6:14, Titus 2:13, Hebrews 10:25, Revelation 2:25, and other passages all indicate that the hearer or the reader would, or at least could, live until the Lord returned. And if you're one who doesn't already believe in the concept that the Lord returned at the end of the last generation of national Israel, or at the end of the first generation of our Christian brethren, all you need to do is consult these passages to see that they all, including James 5, relate to this very theology. That is, that as the Lord promised his audience in Matthew 16:27 through 28, some in Jesus' own generation would still be alive when he returned. A figurative spiritual advent. Luke 17:20 through 23, that was visibly demonstrated to have transpired by the fulfillment of the promised events of the AD 70 demise of Jerusalem and therefore Judaism. Compare Luke 17:24-37 and Jesus' Olivet Discourse in Matthew 23:32-24 and verse 51. And I spent a lot more time on this sort of thing in other audios or podcasts and articles and even books on my website, asightforthelord.com. You can find one entire audio and transcript on the timing related to the coming of the Lord, the time statements found in the Bible. So go check that out if you'd like to spend a little more time on this before you go on into the book of James. Secondly, in chapter 5, verse 8 of James continues to tell our first generation persecuted, suffering Christian brethren to be patient, for the coming, that is the parousia of the Lord, is at hand, literally has drawn near. Here's something very interesting about the Greek word for at hand, which is engiken here. All 5 Greek terms and Strong's exhaustive concordance that begin with eng in the part of engiken are related to the hand, something close by. Think about the following. Engizo means to be near at hand. Engrapho means to engrave, inscribe, write with the hand. Engus refers to a pledge, as by a handshake. Engus means at hand, near, nigh, ready. And enguteron, a comparative adjective, means nearer, closer at hand. My point? Well, it's obvious that the etymology of the term James chose had to do with something close that would soon transpire. It had drawn near upon them. By the way, this is the same word that's found in several passages like Matthew 21:1, where it speaks of Jesus having drawn near to Jerusalem, and Matthew 26:46, where it speaks of Judas being at hand with the soldiers in his betrayal of Jesus, and Philippians 2:30, where it speaks of Epaphroditus as having been near death. With all that before us, and though it may be difficult to fathom for a lot of Christians today, Berean-minded people, Acts 17:11, must seriously consider how that the same meaning for engizo in every passage related to the Lord's return in and with His kingdom is the same as it is in relation to every other passage in which it's found. For example, Matthew 3:2, Matthew 4:17, Matthew 10:7, Mark 1:5, Luke 10:9, Luke 10:9, Luke 10:11, Luke 21:20, Luke 21:28, Romans 13:12, Hebrews 10:25, 1 Peter 4:7. The word engizo and related words to that root word mean the same thing as in every other case. Something at hand, close by, that is near or has drawn near. And all this information I've shared here means that this letter, even if not written by Elder James, who died AD 62, it was certainly written before the demise of Jerusalem and hence Judaism in AD 70. One more thing before moving on to the last question in this intro to James. I just want to quickly emphasize here that which I mentioned earlier in passing. The brethren to whom James was writing were comprised primarily of Hebrew Christians who were being persecuted for the decision to become disciples of Jesus as the Christ. The Hebrew people, chiefly the 2 tribes, Jesus' own Judahite brethren, the Jews, and even more chiefly their leaders, who refused to accept Jesus as the Christ, were behind this oppression, even if and when it came via the Romans. So James, like the writers of practically every other letter in the New Testament, was attempting to encourage these first generation brethren of his and ours, those James called the first fruits of God's new creation, chapter 1, verse 18, in their time of tribulation by Judaizers. Again, he was wanting to encourage them in that time of tribulation by Judaizers, of which we don't have anymore. By the way, as the first fruits of the creation of the eternal kingdom of heaven, those brethren then, James 1:18, were therefore the ones who had to endure the testing of the fruit before the harvest could be carried out. Another figure that's employed for this time of transition from the Old Covenant way of life to New Covenant way of life was that of the betrothed bride having to go through a period of purification prior to her wedding, the time when the covenant was once and for all secured. So I'll be employing that kind of language from time to time throughout our studies in the book of James. Now, I was going to stop at that point to split the introduction, but it looks like we're not doing too badly here, so let me go ahead and finish with the question of why was the Epistle of James written, especially since I wasn't really planning on spending time on the detailed part of the outline I shared with you in the table of contents. So, why was the Epistle of James written? Mainly due to the troublesome times in which the addressees were living. When we read the letter of James, we discover that those to whom the author wrote were having problems in their individual personal lives as well as in their general lives in relation to the church, the bride of Christ, which was being tormented by unbelievers. We find that some were going through difficult trials, some were facing temptations to sin, some were catering to the rich while others were being robbed by the rich, some were competing for offices in the church, particularly teaching offices, some were failing to have their lives match their lips, some were having serious tongue problems, even to the point of creating divisions. Some were dealing with worldliness in various forms. Some were becoming spiritually weaker instead of stronger in their trials. And some were straying away from the Lord and His church due to those trials. Now, though I'll be leaving it to you to make most of the applications throughout these studies for you living today in the 21st century, let me ask this to get you started. As we consider this list, does it really seem to be all that much different from the problems plaguing the average Christians today? In other words, haven't we known or don't we know Christians who are suffering for one reason or another, who are constantly facing temptations and weaknesses, who like to snuggle up to the rich and the famous, who always want to teach but seldom listen, who talk one way but walk another way, who can't or rather don't control their tongues, who have serious problems with worldliness, who seem to be slowly, surely straying from the Lord, or those who'd be better off if they just submitted to God? Yes, surely we know people like that. People are people, right? So, forgetting for the moment that the troubles of our first generation brethren were much worse than ours, it almost sounds like James was dealing with our problems today. But actually, James didn't intend for his audience to think he was dealing with many problems, because he was actually only dealing with one problem: spiritual immaturity, the cause of their many temporal issues at the time, and which, according to chapter 5, 7 through 9, if not checked, would surely lead to even worse eternal problems for them. See, the folks James addressed simply weren't emulating the one to whom they were betrothed and the one like whom they surely wanted to become. Check out 1 John chapter 2, 28 through chapter 3, verse 2. This is reminiscent of Paul's words in Romans 13, 12 through 13. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. So let's cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let's walk properly as in the day, not in revelry, drunkenness, licentiousness, etc. So this gives us a hint as to the basic theme of James, namely, the marks of maturity for those who belong to Christ. And since individuals comprised the bride body to be, they needed to be minding their P's and Q's. So for the body itself in general to be, as a corporate body, mature, the individuals had to be mature, the individuals who comprised that bride. James used the Greek word telos several times. A word, though often translated perfect, refers to maturity. By the phrase, a perfect man, in chapter 3, verse 2, for example, he wasn't referring to the concept of a sinless person, but to that which characterized such a person, someone balanced, sober-minded, and wise. One reason I chose the word wise here is because, right along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, James has been categorized by historians and scholars as wisdom literature. Why? It's wisdom literature partly because of the style in which it was written. But it's also wisdom literature because not only does about 10% of it speak directly of wisdom, but wisdom is in fact its unbroken theme. Apparently, James knew that it was impossible for them to disassociate wisdom from spiritual maturity, either as individuals or as the body as a whole. Even though, as of today, all things have been fulfilled relative to God's creation of a spiritually mature kingdom for his people, humans are still human. In other words, we as humans still lack some of the principles of spiritual maturity that James shared in this great piece of literature, meaning that we can learn from it. Too many Christians aren't mature enough to even desire the solid spiritual food they need. So, like those Jewish Christians Paul chided in Hebrews 5:11 through chapter 6 verse 2, they remain on milk. Someone once said that many churches are playpens for babies instead of workshops for adults. In fact, notice how many problems James dealt with which are typical of little children. Little children are impatient, and some of these people were too, chapter 1, 2 through 4. Little children character play, and some of these people were hypocritical too, chapter 2, 14 through 26. Little children have a lack of tongue control, and some of these people had that too, chapter 3, 1 through 12. Little children fight and covet, and some of these people did that too, chapter 4, 1 through 12. And little children collect toys, and some of these people did that too, chapter 5, 1 through 6. I think our Heavenly Father still today desires grown-ups to share His true good news with the world. But it often seems like all He has among His people are little children. It's interesting to note that 5 chapters of this letter suggest 5 marks of mature Christians. Chapter 1, patient people under trials. Chapter 2, adherence to the truth. Chapter 3, managers of the tongue. Chapter 4, peacemakers. And chapter 5, prayer warriors. To be more specific about why James penned this letter in 2 and 4 of them, he wrote to clarify the nature of trials, chapter 1, to explain the character of temptations, chapter 1, to appeal for religious practice, chapter 1, to rebuke them for their partiality, chapter 2, to show the need for actions as proof of faith, chapter 2, to warn against the improper use of the tongue, chapter 3, to describe the nature of spiritual wisdom, chapter 3, to contrast worldliness with spirituality, chapter 4, to emphasize dependence upon God, chapter 4, to warn the rich against improper use of wealth, chapter 5, to reinforce their need for patience, chapter 5, and lastly, to give guidelines for the recovery of Christians who were drifting away, chapter 5. As an aside here, it's interesting how James seems to logically follow Hebrews in our Bibles. This introduction demonstrates why my approach to James in this book is a little different than my approach to Hebrews in my book on Hebrews mentioned earlier, especially due to the consummation of all things on the horizon, like 1 Peter 4:7 spoke about. One of the major topics of Hebrews is spiritual perfection in Christ. The word perfect is found in Hebrews at least 14 times, the key verse being chapter 6 verse 1 where it reads, "Let us press on to perfection." In other words, in order for them, as a collective, to attain to the perfection of the consummate kingdom cited in Hebrews 12, they seriously needed to focus on their individual spiritual maturity. So Hebrews explains at length the perfect salvation to be had in Christ from a doctrinal standpoint, while the letter of James that follows Hebrews is an appeal from a practical standpoint, an exhortation a lot like 1 John, to act like they were already in possession of the righteousness they were on the verge of actually attaining in Christ. Compare James 5 verse 8 with Romans 4:24 and the phrase "about to" in that verse, and also Galatians 5 verse 5. That's why, as opposed to my book on Hebrews, I'm approaching James with more of a "how may these principles apply to us today" format. Well, now, beginning on page 10, you'll find the more detailed outline of my table of contents outline. And you can go through that on your own and look through it, and you'll see it's very detailed, and it's a great layout of the book of James. Not everyone who grows old grows up. There's a difference between age and maturity. Just because someone had been a Christian for 15 years when James wrote didn't ensure his maturity, even during the era of spiritual gifts. Mature Christians would be happy and useful Christians who would encourage others and edify the bride of Christ in her preparation for her wedding. Now, as we study this great letter today in our day and time, my desire is that we can learn from what James wrote concerning what our first generation brethren were experiencing and enduring, hopefully even finding ways in which we may apply much of it to ourselves today to help us mature in specific areas of our Christian lives as well. Okay, so that's the introduction. I thank you for being with me and listening to this and following along in the book if you had it. And if not, please get a copy. And I mentioned that in the last one, so you have the information already to do that. I look forward to getting back with you pretty soon and getting right into the book itself, beginning with James chapter 1, verse 2, going through verse 12 about affliction. Thank you and have a great week.